So my name is Jubilee Marshall. I'm a junior history major, also doing peace and justice.
I'm Liam. I'm a junior accounting and peace and justice double major. Oh, did that lock?
Leave it open.
Okay, so as you guys know, the title of our presentation is Whitewashed Legacies, What We Don't Learn About Black Leaders. So we're going to be focusing specifically on Nelson Mandela and MLK to kind of talk about this phenomenon. But if anyone else has any time wants to pipe in, share information, please do. We kind of want to make this as interactive as possible based on what people are feeling.
So this is a quote that we just like everyone to keep in mind as we go through our presentation. Historical memory was not merely an entity altered by the passage of time. It was a prize in a struggle between rival versions of the past, a question of will, of power, of persuasion. So like Liam said, we're going to be going through talking about Mandela and Dr. King. And as sort of a disclaimer, we have a lot of ideas about sort of how their legacies are handled and for what purposes, but we aren't experts on either of them. So if anyone has information or questions, we're happy to answer them. And this, again, just as a theme to sort of keep in mind as we go through.
Okay, so the first figure we're going to be talking about is Nelson Mandela. So we kind of just want to start with getting an idea of what people know about him, because a lot of this is kind of based on a baseline perception of how we learn about him. So if anyone wants to raise your hand, any ideas of Nelson Mandela, what he means to you, how you learned about him in school, anything that kind of comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I know that I didn't really learn specifically about Nelson Mandela in school. I mean, we talked about him, but there was not a unit, and we didn't really learn about Africa as a continent ever. And I think one thing that's really telling is in my head when I think of Nelson Mandela, there's sort of also Morgan Freeman is there from Invictus, which I think is really evident of the fact that it's not something that you learn in depth or really get a good understanding of.
Anyone else or?
All I remember is third grade was our one. We had one day about him. We learned about him. He was a symbol of peace for South Africa. Was at least what we were taught.
So going along the lines, I actually studied abroad in South Africa last fall, and that's kind of what gave me the idea of this presentation. So when I went in, I kind of had that idea of him being a symbol of peace. I remember in my high school global history class, we learned about him next to Gandhi and Desmond Tutu and other international kind of famous figures that are famous for civil disobedience and fighting oppression in non-violent ways. So I went in this kind of with this idea that Nelson Mandela was just that, a peaceful symbol. He kind of united South Africa when apartheid fell, peacefully, never really struck against the white oppressors. And then learning that that wasn't true, I thought that was an interesting phenomenon and kind of speaks to how we learn about black leaders. So just before I get into our presentation about him, I just kind of want to give a brief biography. So he was born in 1918. He kind of went through, he was born East Xhosa, kind of grew up in an elite, kind of, he had access to education and everything, more so than the average black South African would. And then eventually joins the ANC, forms the Youth League, which became kind of a more radical wing of the ANC. So the African National Congress was the political party that was mostly black and kind of fought against the apartheid state politically until they were banned. And then ultimately he was arrested in 1963, I think it was, for his leadership in kind of the armed wing of the ANC and violently attacking strategic government locations like power lines and trains and things like that, and then served 27, almost 28 years in prison until he was released in 1991. Apartheid ended around that time, and then in 1994, during the first free election, he was elected the first president of post-apartheid South Africa, which is significant because he obviously was black, and before, blacks couldn't even vote, and now immediately we have a black president. And then he's kind of celebrated internationally as this figure of reconciliation because when he did ultimately become president, he kind of advocated for coming together rather than punishing whites who had oppressed him and other black South Africans. So I wanted to start by showing kind of our image of how the US government handled Mandela. So here we have Mandela meeting both Bush presidencies, first in the 80s and then in the 2000s. And we kind of see Mandela coming and being celebrated for kind of his leadership in the freedom of South Africa and the end of apartheid. And this kind of paints the picture that the US, one, is supporting him through and through. We're really happy that he's free, that he's president, that the people of South Africa have been freed from apartheid, when in reality that's not true, and the government's perception of Mandela is kind of the opposite of this like smiling man. So during both of these visits, he actually was on the official terrorist watch list in the United States for his involvement in communism, and Reagan actually labeled him the most dangerous communist outside of the USSR in the 80s. So that's kind of the tone of, he's in prison at this point. He's not even like really doing anything. Like the public does not have access to him, and they're still labeling him the most dangerous communist outside of the Soviet Union, which given like Cold War politics is obviously a huge statement to make. And then so he ultimately was not released from the terrorist watch list in 2008. So during both of those visits, like the Supreme Court justice had to like, or Secretary of State, had to like waive his visa application because technically he was not allowed in the country because he was labeled a terrorist by the U.S. government. And it's crazy to think that he became president in 1994, was president until 1999, and it wasn't until 2008, after countless like political visits to the United States, that he was still deemed a terrorist for his involvement in communism. And then even further, something that's often not known or talked about is that the U.S. had a kind of a direct involvement in arresting him. So the CIA actually provided the tip to the apartheid government of where Mandela would be. He was traveling from Durban to Johannesburg, like disguised as a chauffeur when he was arrested, and the U.S. kind of told them exactly where he was going to be, and that ultimately led to 27 years of imprisonment. And the U.S. did this because they saw him as a strategic objective. He was very much a symbol of violence in South Africa. So whereas we see Mandela as a symbol of peace and non-violence, a lot of young activists fighting apartheid in that day were inspired by kind of his commitment to violence, to not sitting down and like bowing to the people, the powers that be, and responding to violence with violence in order to be freed. This is the CIA agent that was responsible for giving the tip. He recently died, but before he did so, he kind of came forward and said, "We were tooting on the brink here and it had to be stopped," which meant Mandela had to be stopped, and I put a stop to it. So this goes to show that the United States was not this like benign force where we ultimately saved South Africa by like supporting sanctions and things like that. In reality, we were fighting the freedom of like the end of apartheid through and through for most of the struggle. And then going back to like kind of what Jubilee said, she mentioned like Morgan Freeman earlier, that a lot of that comes from like the thing of Invictus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the popular culture and like the media presentation of Mandela. So first in Invictus in 2009, this focuses entirely on like a series of events revolving around the World Cup that was hosted in 1995. So 1995, South Africa holds the World Cup, and it's a huge deal because they're being welcomed back into international sports, because they were banned from like participating in like the Olympics, the World Cups, because of their involvement in apartheid. But then in 1995, they're allowed to because apartheid has ended, and they're actually the host. And so the entire movie focuses on Mandela's like commitment to supporting the rugby team, because rugby during this time was seen as this like sport of the oppressor. So basically, Black South Africans would always root against whoever was playing against the South African rugby team, because it was a white sport. Like you only played if you were white. Like white people could only afford to go and watch the games. Like so, Black South Africans supported soccer, and then white South Africans kind of supported rugby. But then in Mandela's like supporting the South African rugby team, it's kind of seen as like a bridge of like a cultural divide that existed within like the white South Africans and the Black South Africans. But this kind of movie kind of again leads to the symbol of peace, and like you only associate Mandela with reconciliation, when in reality that's not what he did. And then kind of something that's another like problem with the movie is that it focuses exclusively on Mandela's like obsession with white South Africans in rugby, and sometimes he'll be like in huge important meetings about like really important things like providing water and like housing to all like Black South Africans who have been freed from apartheid, and he'll get up in the middle of the meeting and like turn on the news and like watch like news outlets talking about rugby and things like that, which is obviously very dishonest. Like he was a president who had obviously a lot of problems to deal with a country that had just come out of apartheid, that it's not like rugby kind of just encapsulated his whole presidency. And then moving forward to like Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. Oh, also, I probably should ask this. Has anyone seen any of these movies? Okay, so that's good. So this one actually becomes really important because it came out to theaters a week after Mandela died. So it's like they weren't obviously planning for him to die the week before it came out, but like consequently became a symbol of him. Like he died, so he was in the news a lot, and so a lot of people saw this movie and kind of saw this as like who he was because it's based on his autobiography. And like the caption at the top, like on this poster, says, "The leader you knew, the man you didn't." So it's kind of talking about how we know his politics. Like we don't really need to talk about this. Like let's talk about his life. But the problem becomes a lot of the movie focuses on his like personal relationships with people, including, so he was married 3 times. He was like kind of a womanizer, and like obviously that makes for good drama, like good movies. So a lot of it's like focusing on like, oh, he cheated on his wife here, like, oh, he slept with this girl, and things like that. While again not addressing any of the things that kind of were really crucial and important to his politics as he develops as a leader. So kind of you see the image of like him as a womanizer without fully understanding that he was a politician, a leader who was very radical, but he's this toned down like womanizer in this movie. And then going along with that, so the way his death was covered also kind of like whitewashed and like erased a lot of his radical views. So the first, like I just picked 2 little excerpts from articles that were covering his death when they originally came out in 2013. So CNN says, his message of reconciliation, not vengeance, inspired the world after he negotiated a peaceful end to segregation and urged forgiveness for the white government that imprisoned him. So this becomes important, again, as in reinforcing the idea that he was super forgiving, and that's what the right answer is. Like, he was a good president because he forgave every single white people that imprisoned him, that murdered millions of black South Africans during apartheid, and associating him with, like, he was good because he forgave kind of has the underlying tone of people that were, like villainizes people that weren't as quick to forgiveness or maybe hold grudges against white people, when in reality that's a very fair and kind of logical response to being imprisoned and like oppressed for like hundreds of years. And the New York Times kind of becomes even worse. So it says, except for a youthful flirtation with black nationalism, he seemed to have genuinely transcended the racial passions that tore at his country. So in the first half, it becomes problematic because it describes black nationalism as he only youthfully flirted with it. So it kind of like villainizes it and kind of trivializes the idea of black nationalism as a whole. Like it becomes this like youthful thing that is uninformed. It's not valid response to oppression. It's just blacks being like unrealistic and just childish in how they respond to their oppression, which is obviously not true. And Mandela was a black nationalist at this time. Like, as I said, he formed the ANC Youth League and was really active in that. And then we move into the second part of the quote. It claims that he transcended the racial passions that tore at his country, which again is like kind of just a huge statement to make. Like, yes, the ANC was non-racial in its demographics. Like, anyone could become a member of the ANC, but by no means does that mean he was like colorblind in his actions or policies. Like, he recognized that black people needed to be uplifted after 60 years of oppression under apartheid and segregation and colonialism. Like, he did not ignore the fact that black people in South Africa, black South Africans, needed special treatment. He was not non-racial. He just, in his politics, included everyone in kind of the decision-making process. It's not that he saw whites and blacks as equals in any way. Like, he did not transcend racial passion. He was a black, like, radical activist. And then finally, I just kind of want to go back to him as like this symbol of peace and kind of talk about his direct involvement in the opposite of peace. So Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means the spear of the nation, was the military branch of the ANC, as I talked about, and he was the founding commander of this branch. And here he says, at the meeting I argued that the state had given us no alternative to violence. I said it was wrong and immoral to subject our people to armed attacks by the state without offering them some kind of alternative. And then this photo is him receiving military training in Algeria. So prior to like forming officially the military branch, he traveled to Algeria and Ethiopia to receive military training from their like military wings in those countries to kind of then be able to effectively lead this like military branch of his party. And so this kind of just goes to show that you can't just simplify Mandela to peace. He directly advocated for peace at certain times, but saw it more as like a strategic tactic. And then once it became clear that that tactic was no longer going to be effective, when the apartheid state responded to nonviolent protest with just mass murder and incarceration, he kind of said, move forward, they gave us no alternative, we have to turn to violence. And that's a legitimate response. And then something that's kind of important with this, so December 16th, 1961 was the first armed attack, so they sabotaged and blew up power lines in 3 areas of South Africa. But what's significant about this is December 15th, 1961, the president of the ANC at the time, so his superior, Albert Luthuli, won the Nobel Peace Prize and he gave a speech in Oslo about kind of peaceful protest and how South Africa, the black South Africans, would be free through peaceful protests, but then the next day Mandela launches a military campaign against the apartheid government. So this kind of is symbolic of the international people, you can't just look away. You can't just give us this peace prize and say like, oh, like look at all they're doing. They're fighting apartheid peacefully. Like that's so great. Like that doesn't do anything for the fact that we're still being oppressed by the government. We are going to stand up for what we do. And then ultimately this led to his arrest because he was convicted of like life imprisonment, convicted of treason, sentenced to life imprisonment for this act and like all the acts that Nkante Wesizwe would eventually commit.
Okay, so then the other figure we're going to be talking about is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Same question, in middle school and high school, if anyone has experiences of learning about him, sort of what impression did you get, what was the narrative that was put forward? Yeah, sure.
Also, he was just like a leader of peaceful protests and march. I mean, you just look at his face and hear, "I have a dream." That's it, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. I mean, I know everyone learned about Martin Luther King, so to give sort of the brief overview, I think that's definitely the narrative that gets put forward. But he was born in 1929. He was a Baptist minister and activist. He is often put forth as the leader of the civil rights movement, which isn't exactly accurate, although obviously he was he was in a leadership role and was a very visible spokesperson. He's really well known for nonviolence, civil disobedience, and for having sort of a Christian belief that ran through really everything he did. American history textbook. It's not the one I had, but it is the one all my cousins have. And they've done a lot of studies on the way that both Martin Luther King specifically and sort of race relations in America are taught in middle school and high school. And generally what I think studies have shown is that it is a very sort of whitewashed and depoliticized narrative of, a lot of times it doesn't even really go to Jim Crow. It is a lot of times focused on slavery and then the Civil War, and then sort of we don't really need to talk about race relations anymore. And textbooks that do talk about like the Jim Crow era usually tend to talk about racial violence as being sort of a one-on-one thing, not necessarily isolated incidents, but some members of the Ku Klux Klan did this to a black person, and it really divorces those events from their historical context, from the socio-political context of, well, there were police officers who were sort of in league with them, and they were being protected by the courts, and they were being protected economically and politically and socially, and it really, really presents this narrative of these are sort of isolated hate crimes and not something that extends through every layer of society and something that America as a whole is responsible for allowing to continue. And because that narrative is the one that is put forth, you get this really distorted and oversimplified version of race relations in this country. Just as Liam talked about, you get the same sort of distorted narrative when you learn about Nelson Mandela. So, Martin Luther King Day is obviously a huge day in our country. Recently, corporations often feel very able to use Martin Luther King's image and words to basically sell their products. So this is from Pop Chips. The time is always right to do what is right, and the caption is Eternal Poptimist, #MLK. In the same light, Crazy Glue tweeted this in 2014. I've decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. And a lot of corporations sort of do this. PETA does it, ZQuil does it. There's countless more. I guess some of them are more tasteful than others, but it's a very common phenomenon. And I think what is really interesting in telling about that is in 1967, King published The 3 Evils of Society with this quote: "The problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power." And to be completely frank, King was something of a socialist and believed in welfare programs and economic programs specifically targeting the economically disadvantaged, and he saw economic disadvantage as being very closely and directly tied to racial discrimination. And I think what is also interesting is this is in the Cold War. I think a lot of times in your history classes, you learn about the Cold War and the Jim Crow era as being just very separate events, when really this is all happening at the same time. And to have this massive, this social rights leader with a massive following would have been really significant to a government that was really anti-socialism and really concerned with sort of economic distribution as a political concept. So given that the corporations sort of feel comfortable co-opting MLK, so do conservative pundits. So Bill O'Reilly in The O'Reilly Factor said Martin Luther King Jr. would not participate in Black Lives Matter. And I think people are probably familiar with this, but Black Lives Matter is a activist organization that I believe was originally founded to sort of address extrajudicial killing of Black people by police, but has since published a really comprehensive and intersectional platform that addresses a huge range of social justice issues, civil rights violations, and is really committed to sort of liberation for all marginalized groups in this country. So they're often portrayed as being very disruptive, being thugs, which is a very racialized term, being rioters, and a lot of people, especially conservative people, have gone to great lengths to delegitimize their movement. So, as we said, Bill O'Reilly said this, which I think stands in direct contrast to this quote from The Other America, published in 1968. I know it's long, but it's good. We'll give it a minute. But it is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. So, this is not at all to conflate Black Lives Matter with rioters, but I think it's really telling that King's published works very explicitly make clear that he's not concerned with protecting the status quo, he's not concerned with tranquility, he's concerned with justice for people that have been systematically oppressed. And so I think it's really interesting that a lot of conservative pundits like Bill O'Reilly, like the example we'll talk about in a minute, feel that they are right to co-opt his words and his legacy in order to delegitimize protesters who are protesting very real situations of systemic oppression today. This couple weeks ago on MLK Day, this was the cover of The New Yorker. It shows Colin Kaepernick and Michael Bennett kneeling with Martin Luther King. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Colin Kaepernick and Michael Bennett are two of a number of particularly football players, but athletes in general who have been kneeling during the national anthem in protest of the position of Black people in America and mistreatment by police, which, like Black Lives Matter, they have received a lot of disapproval, a lot of really negative media attention. People say that they're disrespecting the troops, that they're disrespecting their position as highly paid athletes. There's been a lot of negative press. So in response to this, Fox News published an article, the headline of which was this: "Please stop politicizing MLK Day. It is a day for national unity, not political division." Which is a lot. It was really hard to find a good quote from this because really every sentence was a gift. But this one I think really stands out. This is by Jeremy Hunt. "This day shouldn't be about whether or not Dr. King would support the national anthem protests. Frankly, no one will ever know. Perhaps we should reflect on what we do know about Dr. King, his teachings on love, his commitment to ministering the gospel, his dream of equality for all people." So, a couple of things about this. First of all, this statement is bad history, and it's bad it's bad analysis, right? Of course, Martin Luther King doesn't have a statement about Black Lives Matter because he was killed in 1968. And Black Lives Matter and Colin Kaepernick's protests happened way later. Yeah, right, so he doesn't have an explicit statement about it. But to suggest that you can't look at his numerous works and figure out what his politics were and figure out how he would have responded to situations of systemic oppression is really disingenuous, right? Okay, is really disingenuous. And in addition, I think this really speaks to this idea of Martin Luther King as being, like Nelson Mandela, a unifying force, a force for peace, someone who was really against division in the country, someone who overcame racial passions, and I think that's really just untrue, right? So this is who Martin Luther King was. He was arrested. He was nonviolent, yes, and I think a lot of times that gets translated as being very passive or being very concerned with the status quo. But every part of his politics were aimed at being disruptive and aimed at making significant change for oppressed people. Oh yeah, that's fine. So in 1966, Gallup did a poll on, not specifically Martin Luther King, but a lot of just general leaders, and 64% of Americans disapproved of MLK. Interestingly, the only person in America who was more disliked than MLK was Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union, which is huge, right? Because, like I said, you learn about the Soviet Union and the Cold War as being this very different time and place, and in a very different context. But given how much we all know about sort of the Cold War tensions and how much of a big deal communism was, the only person in America who people disliked more than MLK was Nikita Khrushchev. That's like a huge statement. And that's compared to 2011, when only 6% of Americans disapproved of MLK, and 74% of Americans believed that his dream of racial equality had been realized or major progress has been made. Right? So I think this speaks to this idea that, well, you know, all of that race stuff happened during the civil rights era, and now we're post-racial, now we don't need to think about it. We're all equal, you know, a black man was elected president, we're fine. Everyone likes MLK now, and really, I think, doesn't have an understanding of really how politically divisive he was. And I think what's also telling is today, 59% of Americans disapprove of Black Lives Matter, and 41% of Americans believe that Black Lives Matter advocate violence. And I don't mean to draw like a strict parallel of there was this amount of people that disapprove of MLK, and the same amount of people disapprove of Black Lives Matter, and so Black Lives Matter is immune from criticism or anything like that. But I think it's telling that we have this idea of Black Lives Matter today is really divisive, and they advocate violence, and we shouldn't be supporting them. But we were all on the right side of history in '66, and everyone was down with integration, and we really wanted it to be a post-racial society, and that's what everyone was fine with. Right? And I think this is also telling. So King received a lot of hate mail. I'm going to show you two examples. I'm not going to read this because of language, but take a minute. I think what's interesting about this is you see a lot of sort of similar objections that you hear today, right? They talk about black-on-black violence. They talk about there's a lot of anger. This is the next one. Here's another one. Accusations of division, that Martin Luther King is responsible for riots and havoc. And this is, like I said, just two of like thousands and thousands of hate mail that he received, which shows that he really was very divisive. Not everyone was sort of fine with his political agenda, and he got assassinated. Like, when I remember learning about MLK in middle school, like, obviously you learn that he was killed, but like, more than that, I think you learn he's the symbol of peace, he's the symbol of unity, and sort of anything beyond that gets very overlooked. I do think there's a real push, especially in recent years, to sort of stop this narrative and sort of reclaim his radical politics. So one in particular, this artist, Daniel Rarella, maybe is how you say that, has created, you probably saw this circulating on Twitter or other forms of social media, has created this series of graphics that superimpose some of Martin Luther King's more radical quotes over scenes of protest. So you have the march in Selma, you have a more recent protest in the past couple years. So on the left, you deplore the demonstrations taking place, but your statement fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I'm sure that none of you would want to rest content with a superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with the effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. And then on the right, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who constantly says, I agree with you in the goals you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. So these are both taken from the letter from Birmingham jail, and I think really show that, how radical he was and how clearly he saw what the political situation was, what race relations were like when he lived, and what he needed to do to affect change.
So kind of just like conclude with drawing connections between like both the way that Nelson Mandela is treated and MLK. We kind of just want to wrap up with a kind of concrete, like, how does this affect us today? Like, why are we talking about why we talk about these leaders that are both dead? What it means for current race relations and MLK's and stuff today. So the first we identified was that it depoliticizes MLK and Mandela's actions and legacy. Like, as we said, they're seen as symbols of unity, not as radical figures who advocated for change. So when you talk about them, it loses their meaning, essentially. Like, they're just a symbol of peace. And like, yes, everyone kind of has a vague understanding of what they do, more so MLK than Mandela, but you can't really like look to them as a radical figure anymore when everyone's understanding of them is they were peaceful and they did what they wanted, they got what they got done, and like, hooray, thanks for them.
It also changes how we view modern civil rights activists, and it delegitimizes sort of a lot of forms of protest because they're really put forward as pacifists, as people who use nonviolent disobedience. It has become such that really any form of protest that is disruptive in kind of any way is really harshly condemned for being too political or too disruptive. So something like Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, which is, in the grand scheme of things, not that disruptive. Like what is that really doing beyond him exercising his right to protest? Even things like that, people are saying, well, that's not the right form of protest, that's not what should be happening, there must be a different way. And eventually you sort of get to the question of, okay, well, is the right form of protest that everyone's just fine with it? Are we all just sort of being mad alone, and are we not supposed to do anything to challenge the status quo?
Yeah, and like on top of that, it kind of creates like this like, impossible standard for how we assess like modern day civil rights activists and specifically with Mandela, like African leaders. So like comparing Colin Kaepernick and like Black Lives Matter, as we said before, like everyone loves MLK, like thinks of him as this great guy that like everyone was marching on Washington. It wasn't just MLK and like radicals. You can't compare that to someone who's like divisive today because how like MLK accomplished it by being unifying. Like why are you being divisive? Like as we said before. And with African leaders, another thing is like we're kind of given this image that he cooperated entirely with like Western governments and like the United States. So now an African leader focusing on the AU, like African Union specifically, like focusing on African issues and like kind of socialist, like with like protective tariffs and things like that, is seen as like isolation, like an isolationist, like they're bad leaders because they're not working directly how we want them to work. So when they resist kind of like neo-colonial forces like the IMF and the World Bank, which kind of gives the United States and Western countries like power over Africa, because Mandela like did that and cooperated, other African leaders who aren't are kind of like bad leaders and they're criticized by like Western media outlets.
This just occurred to me, but I also think, sorry, I'm adding stuff. I also think it's interesting when you look at like nonviolent activists. So like we think of people like Malcolm X, how in many ways Martin Luther King's legacy is leveraged against people who were Black nationalists or who were like prepared for armed struggle as a way of saying, well, they were very divisive and they were not someone that we should be learning about, because there's this good example of a good, safe civil rights leader who wasn't about armed struggle and who was willing to be nonviolent.
Yeah, that definitely fits with like the Black Panthers, like the way I remember like, my history textbooks. It'd be like this long essay, and like we would learn the "I have a dream" speech. Like in 8th grade, I had to memorize it, and then there was like this tiny sentence, and it was like, and then the Black Panthers were like killing people and like murdering people and just like horrible people. So like Black nationalism, but like look at this like nice white, like picture white children like holding hands on the hills of Alabama. So like it's like very like it's like basically explicit at a certain point that like this is what you should be like, even when we're like oppressing you, like this is how you want to respond to like your own oppression. Whereas like this is not acceptable. Like we'll just kind of come at you harder.
And finally, it creates a false historical narrative of racial discrimination. So we talked a little bit about the way that it's talked about in textbooks. It's really not talked about structurally or systemically. It ends up saying, yeah, there were bad people who were racist, but you know we got them, so it's fine. It's fine now, and we don't need to talk about voter ID laws or economic injustice or ways that violence is enacted in ways other than physical. And also, as we've said, really paints this picture of everyone wanted this everyone was down with this. Everyone was pro-integration, and MLK was universally beloved, and no one was threatened by sort of the politics that he was putting forth. So we're going to close with a quote. White America on all sides commonly takes selective ownership of Black history narratives that are produced by the state itself and uses them against Black people who it deems troublesome. And that sort of in conjunction with the thing we talked about at the beginning, the quote that we gave you at the beginning, which is about history and how history isn't just something that, you know, it sort of passively got shaped. Now, for whatever reason, we are remembering MLK and Mandela and other Black leaders in this way, but it's something that really does matter for how politics and protest functions in America today. Okay. So we'll take questions or comments.
Yeah, so
or anything.
even if you don't have questions, but like something to add.
Just one thing that's interesting, I think that can be added to that, like that's related to that last quote. Like as far as the holiday itself, I learned last year in one of my classes that it was the presidential administration that made it the national holiday was of all administrations the Reagan administration, and I sort of took that as exactly what that quote was. It's sort of like they're co-opting the legacy of MLK and sort of making it into something that is conducive to, you know, a particular narrative of Black activist history in the United States, and sort of like taming him in terms of how we like view his legacy through this holiday. And just like exactly what you said, like the legacy has turned into something that's completely different than what it should be viewed as. And you know, that's just the type of people who Reagan administration was.
I think it's even interesting when you look at like the Freedom School as an institutionalized way of sort of combating this, of saying, okay, yes, we have off school, we have day of service, which is obviously has merit on its own, but also we're going to do this like educational aspect of it, and people who want to talk about peace and justice things can do that in a way that's specifically tied to King's legacy as an activist.
And going along with that, something that's like I've thought about a lot is like now our standard for like political leaders on like days like MLK is like, oh, they tweeted like this day we honor, like they picked a quote from MLK and then post it, and like they basically act like that means they're like for radical, well, not for radical, but like for racial equality. Like, oh, like, they tweeted, like that's like a standard. If they didn't tweet, we'll criticize them for not tweeting something on MLK Day instead of for like their policies that directly affect and like oppress Black people. So like, it's just like a weird, like obviously the day is a good thing in sentiment, but the way we respond to like it is just completely flawed in a lot of ways.
I'm gonna say something else, but just to like your other point of like the tweets or whatever, I usually see like the same 4 quotes of MLK, and then people like that 4 sentences in his full life. And so like that in itself is like, which ones can we get off of Google like first? Which like when you were talking made me think of that. But I just thought it was really interesting. I went and saw Diane Nash yesterday, who worked really closely with Dr. King, spoke about him, spoke about how he was not in fact the leader of the civil rights movement, which I was like glad that you guys talked about. And someone actually asked her like, oh, do you think like Dr. King would have supported like what kind of like protests that he would have supported or whatever? And she, someone who actually knew him and like organized SNCC and the Freedom was like, I don't know. And like it actually doesn't really matter because like what if he wouldn't have, he still wouldn't have been the leader of the civil rights movement. He still like his approval on it doesn't mean that you are valid or invalid, and to use him is a cop out. So I thought that was interesting that that's something that you guys have talked about, and something that I think her talking about yesterday on such a large platform is like it's often used, especially if you do support Black Lives Matter. Like I've been told this, like Dr. King or like the people in the civil rights movement, like that's not how they did it. They wouldn't like that, and it's sort of like that doesn't delegitimize like what people are doing today. So I thought that was really interesting.
I really like the slide on the approval rates. And just like this idea that like everyone acts like they were like, with MLK since forever. Like it's as if like white people have always just like been on his side and like he like made this miracle happen and he was like, and that's not to like delegitimize his work or anything. But like something I'm looking at like one thing I've been learning very recently about like very recently. I like grew up my whole life knowing or not knowing, learning about how like Latinos were involved in the civil rights movement, and the way it was taught for me, I went to predominant Latino high school, so we had like the privilege of being able to learn a little bit more Latino history. I don't know how that is in other parts of the country, but
So that's not a unit.
well, so like now I also learned that it was bad on my part because like when we were learning about it, it was just like, oh yeah, like all these like the farm working movement was like right hand in hand with MLK. Like Filipinos were also like they were marching. The Jewish people were marching right alongside Martin Luther King, and like there's just like all these other people of color that were like with him. It wasn't until recently, now I'm like in college, I'm like starting to read more texts, and realizing like even other people of color were like completely against him, completely against the civil rights movement. Like a lot of like Latino leaders were like, yeah, like we want a lot of like great things for we're gonna end segregation for Mexicans, but like don't even think about ending segregation for Black people. Like we still want to be separate from Black people. And it was just like, and it's like I guess the right comment is like this is not just a white phenomenon. This is like a very much a phenomenon that happens with anyone who isn't Black, essentially. Like just like acting like they've always been part of this movement, and like oh, we were right there with him because we have the same struggles. Like if you really read back to a lot of these texts and archives, it was like all these like farm-working leaders, they were all like, yeah, like we're not gonna collaborate with that guy because he's Black and we don't care about his struggles. I think that's really interesting how even it's like, I don't know if whitewash is the right word for like this instance and other people of color, but like I don't really know how to like give a word to that phenomenon. Just this idea that everyone was with him and like that wasn't the case at all.
I think also like when you're talking about Mandela and how like the government acted like they loved him, but like secretly he was on like the terrorist list. Like kind of the same thing happened with MLK, and like the government like pretends that like, oh my gosh, we love MLK, like we're gonna make a holiday for him, and like the CIA like followed him and sent his wife like pictures of him cheating on her and was like super against him, but it just like co-opts it now and is like we just love MLK, like we're so accepting.
There's a monument. Like, of course we love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question. So, specifically about the portrayal of Mandela, is it different? Did you find that it was different in South Africa, or is it similar to what we get here?
So it's definitely depends on your community. So like, I don't know how familiar. I mean, me and Tori studied abroad there. So like, apartheid's still like visibly present. Like white and Black is still very much separated in most places you go. So when you talk to like Black South Africans and like Indians and like colored people, or like colored is like a racial classification in South Africa also, like not Mexican, sorry. And like colored people, a lot of them would be like, they'll talk about him and they'll like know more, and like a lot, like one of my host moms is like, I will like support Mandela to the day I die, and like, but then like white South Africans will focus on things like Invictus, like, oh yeah, like when he went on like the rugby field, like we all went crazy, like it was amazing. And like it's very selective the way that they talk about them, and even like in museums and stuff, like there's obviously like there's a lot being done to kind of make sure people know about things like in controversies way, and like that it wasn't just like this magical like negotiation where we're all the hands. Like there were a lot of like white radical groups that like actively fought the creation of a free South Africa. Like even after the Nationalist Party basically were like, okay, we give up. Like a lot of white radicals were still like advocating for an armed conflict. But you also have to think like a lot of what's being done in South Africa today is like to appease white people, because like white flight in like '94 and like basically all throughout the '90s was so like present, and like so all like the educational capital and like financial capital was like fleeing to countries like Australia, New Zealand, and like UK, that they kind of had to like whitewash their own history in a sense, just like to survive, because if all of these like resources just fled the country, there was no way that it could deal with all of the economic and social problems that were lingering, and that they needed like white investment in. So like a lot of the things that started with Mandela's presidency into Mbeki's presidency was dealing with like getting access to water and food and like electricity, like rural communities and like township communities as well. And they didn't want to risk like putting whites on the spot too much, and like even in like museums and stuff, like not even just at the level of like directly punishing like repossessing property and stuff, but just in the way that they portray their own history. Did that answer your question? So I was like, okay.
Okay, well, yeah, if no one has any questions, that's all we have for you.
Okay, actually, sorry.
Okay.
I just want to say also, I just kind of want to end, like, we don't want to portray, like, the message from this shouldn't be that MLK and Mandela are perfect people, and that we're just taught like of them in an imperfect way. Like we can still be critical of MLK and Mandela, and like, but what kind of messages, like we really have to look beyond like what's the face value that's given to us in like history textbooks and things like that. Like you really have to go above and beyond, like just like reading the assigned reading and taking for what it's worth, or like watching the news clip and being like, oh, that's what happened. Like being critical of our own history and kind of like the world history in sense is like very important for getting a more holistic understanding of like these leaders and like other Black leaders and like civil rights struggles across the globe. Thanks so much for coming too. We were worried it was going to be like 2
Thank you.
And we'll hang around if you guys like have any other questions or something.